December 17th, 1944. The forest of Ardennes groaned under the weight of snow and war. The trees, stripped bare by winter, echoed with distant artillery. Somewhere near Bastogne, a Sherman tank lay hidden behind a shallow ridge, its steel body shivering against the bitter cold. Inside, 4 men sweated beneath layers of wool and fear. Their breath turned to vapor. The main gun had already fired over 24 rounds that morning. The loader's arms ached. The gunner's nerves frayed with each trigger pull. But the real enemy wasn't the freezing wind or even the German panzers circling in. It was the silence, because the belts were almost gone. The machine gun mounted above was empty. The coaxial had only a handful of rounds left, and the standard ammo belts, fabric and metal linked, had jammed twice already in the frost. No resupply, no radio contact, no hope. The tank commander stared at the ice-covered road where smoke curled from the wrecks of American trucks hit hours earlier. His lips cracked as he muttered, "This is it." Then the loader, 22-year-old Calvin Briggs from rural Kentucky, reached into a burlap sack under his seat. He pulled out a roll of something strange. It wasn't army-issued. It looked handmade. Strips of cotton cloth sewn together by uneven hands. Loops stitched carefully, evenly spaced. Inside each loop, 50 caliber cartridges packed tight like corn in a harvest bin. The gunner glanced over, scoffing. "That thing again?" Calvin didn't answer. He just fed it into the gun's receiver. He had stitched it by candlelight over weeks. They laughed when he first showed it. They called it hillbilly engineering. But today, in the middle of a war that chewed through men and machines alike, it was the only belt left. And when he hit the trigger, the Sherman roared. Not for 10 seconds, not for 10 minutes, but for 4 straight hours. Who was Calvin Briggs? Before the snow, before the shells, before the war turned boys into men and machines into lifelines, there was Calvin Briggs. He was born in the spring of 1922 in Lyon County, Kentucky. His family owned a modest farm just west of the Cumberland River. Life wasn't easy, but it was honest. Calvin's hands were calloused by age 10, not from war but from tightening bolts on his father's rusted tractor and rethreading old plow harnesses they couldn't afford to replace. He was the kind of boy who could mend a fence with barbed wire and a belt buckle, who could gut a deer, grease a gearbox and weld a broken axle before most kids learned their times tables. By the time he was 17, he had already built a working engine out of junkyard parts, duct tape and prayer. But Calvin was more than just a farmhand with dirty boots. He had a restless spirit. He read Popular Mechanics like it was the Bible. He once walked 6 miles to a county fair just to see a diesel generator in action. When war broke out in 1939, he followed the headlines like a man watches the sky for storms. Quiet, focused, always calculating. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, Calvin enlisted the next day. Not because he was angry, not even because he was patriotic, at least not in the way posters and parades demand. He joined because he believed in doing things right. Because war as he saw it was the ultimate machine, terrible, loud and unforgiving. And maybe, just maybe, if someone like him who understood how things worked was there to keep the gears turning, a few more boys might live to see their farms again. Calvin was trained as a tank mechanic, but he didn't stay in the rear for long. He volunteered to serve as a loader in the field, insisting that the best way to understand what broke down was to be there when it broke. His officers found him strange but dependable, quiet but not shy and always tinkering. In North Africa, he fashioned a water boiler from old artillery shells. In Sicily, he repaired a busted track using wine barrel bands. And during the long push through France, when supply lines thinned and every nut and bolt mattered, Calvin Briggs became something of a legend. Not because he talked big, but because he fixed big. But his most daring invention didn't come from any battlefield. It came from boredom. Late in 1944, as winter began to bite and the German counteroffensive had yet to strike, Calvin noticed a pattern. The standard fabric ammo belts used to feed the Sherman's Browning machine guns kept jamming in the cold. The metal links warped. The cloth stiffened. Even minor moisture caused the belts to seize. So he started sewing. At first it looked ridiculous. Cotton strips from spare uniforms, canvas bits taken from seat covers, even twine and shoelaces. He stitched loops by hand, spacing them with the help of a bullet casing and a ruler he carved out of wood. He worked at night, hunched over a lantern, cursing when the needle slipped. His crewmates laughed, called it Calvin's country quilt. The gunner told him, "You think Hitler's going to surrender when he sees your arts and crafts project?" Calvin didn't argue. He never did. Instead, he kept refining it, testing it. One day, he loaded it into the backup gun during drills. It fed smoother than standard issue. No jam, no snag, just clean rhythmic fire. Still, no one took it seriously. The quartermaster refused to log it. His lieutenant rolled his eyes. "It's not regulation," he said. "Save it for the county fair back home." So Calvin folded the homemade belt, placed it in a burlap sack and tucked it under his seat, just in case. He never imagined it would be the one thing standing between life and death. But war has a way of turning the absurd into essential. And in the frozen woods of Ardennes, that sack of stitched cotton was about to become the most important invention on the battlefield. Cold, chaos, and a war machine starving for ammo. By December of 1944, the Allies believed the war in Europe was nearly over. They had stormed the beaches at Normandy in June. They had liberated Paris in August. The German army was retreating on nearly every front. Supplies were stretched, yes, but morale was high. Many soldiers thought they'd be home by Christmas. They were wrong. On December 16, 1944, in the dark forests of the Ardennes, Hitler launched a last-ditch counteroffensive. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by 1,000 tanks and massive artillery barrages, smashed into the thinly held American lines. It was bold. It was desperate, and it caught the Allies completely off guard. What followed was chaos. Trucks loaded with winter gear never made it. Fuel convoys were ambushed. Ammunition dumps were bombed. Radios went dead. Tanks, stranded by the dozen, froze in place, literal steel coffins in the snow. For frontline crews like Calvin's, the problems multiplied fast. In the cold, nothing behaved the way it should. Engine oil thickened into sludge. Batteries died without warning. Grease congealed around moving parts. Even the simplest things, like feeding a belt of bullets into a machine gun, became an ordeal. The standard-issue ammo belts for the Sherman's machine guns were fabric-based with metal links spaced for 50 caliber rounds. In desert heat or dry weather, they worked fine. But in the Ardennes, where temperatures dropped below zero and everything was soaked in freezing fog, the belts stiffened. Moisture crept into the fabric. Ice formed in the loops. The links warped slightly in the cold, just enough to cause misfires or total jams. Soldiers tried improvising. Some heated the belts near the engine block before loading. Others rubbed them down with oil or wrapped them in scarves. But the moment you fed them into the gun and started firing, the friction mixed with cold and grit turned them into useless, twisted messes. Gun jams weren't just frustrating, they were fatal. In tank warfare, seconds mattered. If your coaxial or top-mounted machine gun seized during an ambush, the enemy infantry could overrun you. If your loader couldn't keep up with the feeding system, your main gun would fall silent in the middle of a firefight. And that's exactly what was happening across the Ardennes. Entire armored units found themselves under-equipped, undersupplied, and under relentless attack from German panzer divisions who knew the terrain and thrived in cold weather. American supply lines were overextended, tangled across icy back roads, where trucks jackknifed and fuel froze in the lines. One tank crew wrote in a letter weeks later, "We weren't fighting Germans. We were fighting the weather, the roads, and the fact that nothing we had worked like it should." This was the backdrop Calvin Briggs faced when he climbed into his Sherman that morning. No replacement belts were coming. The resupply unit assigned to his battalion had been ambushed the night before. Rumor had it only 2 of the 8 trucks made it through. The others were burning somewhere near Malmedy. His tank, callsign Lion Charlie 4, had less than 200 rounds of machine gun ammo. Half of it was in belts that had already jammed once before. The rest was loose, unlinked, and unusable without proper rigging. Still, they rolled out because they had to, because no one else was left to hold the line in that sector. And as the sky grayed and the snow thickened, Calvin could feel it in his gut. The war wasn't about strategy anymore. It wasn't about generals or politics. It had become something brutally simple. Who could keep their machines running long enough to survive? And tucked beneath his seat, folded neatly in that burlap sack, was the thing everyone had mocked, the thing no one had logged or approved or even looked at twice, a homemade ammo belt stitched by a farm boy with numb fingers and too much time on his hands. And in a matter of hours, That ridiculous invention would become the reason 4 men walked out of the forest alive. The mockery and isolation. It's not army-issued, kid. In the world of war, there is little room for the unconventional. Uniformity is survival. Regulation is gospel. And anyone who dares color outside the lines, no matter how well-intentioned, is often met with more scorn than support. Calvin Briggs learned that early. He had shown his prototype belt to his tank crew during a lull between patrols near the French border. They were parked in a muddy orchard, drinking bitter coffee from metal cups, the sky a dull smear of grey. Calvin, proud but quiet, held up the cloth band like a magician presenting his final act. It didn't look like much. Worn cotton loops, carefully spaced, every inch handmade. The stitching was rough but solid, reinforced with doubled thread. Calvin had even rubbed the fabric with wax and grease to keep it flexible in the cold. The driver chuckled first. "What's that?" "A scarf for bullets." The gunner leaned forward, holding his cup of coffee like a priest with communion wine. "Briggs, what in God's name is this? You sewing for the Red Cross now?" Even the tank commander, Lieutenant Jarvis, a stern man from Ohio with a regulation buzz cut, raised an eyebrow. "Where'd you get the idea?" Calvin explained. "The jamming, the frost, the seized belts." He talked about how the fabric absorbed moisture and stiffened in the cold. He told them about the hours he spent sewing, measuring spacing by hand, testing loops with dummy rounds. He was calm, precise, like a mechanic describing a misfiring engine. But the response wasn't interest, it was laughter. The commander shook his head. "It's not army-issued, kid, and there's a reason for that." The gunner added, "Yeah, fair's 'cause nobody wants to fire a machine gun with their grandma's oven mitt." Even when Calvin managed to show them how the rounds slid into the loops without resistance, how the belt coiled neatly without kinking, how it fed better than metal link chains, they didn't care. They weren't cruel, just tired, cynical. After months of battle, most men stuck to what they knew, what was familiar, even if it didn't work. That night, alone by the side of the tank, Calvin wiped down the belt with a rag and folded it gently into the burlap sack. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He never tried to prove himself again. But he didn't stop either. While others drank or played cards, he tested different cloth types, experimented with oil mixtures, adjusted the stitching to resist fraying. At one point, he even cut up an old duffel bag for sturdier loops. He became something of a quiet curiosity, the ammo belt guy, the running joke. If someone's gun jammed, they'd tease, "Should have used one of Calvin's quilts." If the belts froze, someone might mutter, "Maybe we ought to give the boy his sewing kit back." And yet something about it stuck. Because despite the mockery, no one ever threw his design away. They didn't use it, but they didn't toss it. There was a part of them deep down that hoped he might be right. It wasn't just the crew. The quartermaster refused to log his belts as official equipment. "We're not running a haberdashery," he said. "Get requisitioned gear or don't get anything at all." One sergeant joked that if Calvin kept it up, he'd be sewing patches for the enemy. The message was clear. Innovation without permission was insubordination. But Calvin never sought permission. He wasn't trying to rewrite the rules. He just wanted his machine gun to work when it mattered. He knew it wasn't pretty. He knew it wasn't regulation. But he also knew what happened to tanks that jammed mid-battle. He had seen the burned-out hulks littering roadsides, the blackened turrets torn open by anti-tank fire. He had helped pull the bodies out. And so while they laughed, he kept stitching, because something in his bones told him the worst wasn't over. And when it came, when the real storm hit, he wasn't going to be the one caught pulling frozen metal from a jammed belt, cursing supply lines that would never come. He would be ready, even if no one believed him. The battle begins. The frozen hell of Ardennes. Dawn never truly arrived. On December 17th, the Ardennes sky hung like a lid over the world, heavy with steel-grey clouds that promised more snow. The trees, black and skeletal, leaned over the narrow roads like mourners at a funeral. And beneath them, American tanks waited. Calvin Briggs sat in the loader's seat, his breath steaming in short, controlled bursts. The inside of the Sherman was a mixture of metal, oil and sweat, cold enough to sting his fingers, hot enough to fog his goggles once they started moving. The tank's radio had gone silent around 4 in the morning. Their last message, hold the crossroad at all costs. Lion Charlie 4, his tank, was one of 6 Shermans scattered across a forest clearing east of Bastogne. They weren't in formation. There was no time. They dug in along a shallow ridgeline, trying to cover a frozen logging trail that now served as a vital supply corridor. Or at least it had been, before German shells cratered the road. Then at 7:13 the first shell landed. No warning, just a howling shriek and an eruption of snow, mud and timber 20 yards to their right. The commander's voice cracked through the intercom. "Contact front. Gunner, eyes on." Calvin snapped to action, yanking open the ammo locker and pulling a 48-pound shell into his lap. His fingers fumbled for grip. Everything was slick with frost. Through the periscope slit he saw them, shadows in the trees, camouflaged shapes creeping through snow. German infantry, supported by Panzer WWIIs. The gunner shouted, "Range 600, armor-bearing 295. Calvin jammed the shell into the breech. "Up!" The cannon barked, a boom so loud it punched through the chest, rattling bones. The Sherman rocked back, and somewhere out in the trees, one of the German tanks vanished in a blossom of black and orange. They didn't stop. Another shell screamed in, this time hitting the Sherman next to them, Lion Charlie 2. It didn't explode. It penetrated. The turret hatch blew open like a kicked door. Flames licked skyward. "No movement from 2, the commander muttered. "We're on our own." For the next 10 minutes, Calvin reloaded shell after shell. His gloves shredded, his wrists cramped, his shoulder muscles burned. They fired high-explosive rounds, armor-piercing shells, anything they could reach. Then came the sound he dreaded. The gunner slapped the receiver. Machine guns down. The top-mounted .50 caliber had jammed. The fabric belt was frozen stiff, clogged with ice and mud. Calvin yanked it out, tried warming it with his breath, but it coiled like brittle bark. The coaxial machine gun mounted beside the main cannon still had ammo, but only 30 rounds remained. And German infantry were getting closer. Too close. "Briggs, feed it fast," the gunner shouted. Calvin opened the storage bin. Nothing left but loose rounds and 2 belts they'd already tried and discarded during training. Stiff, swollen, the metal links warped just enough to jam inside the feed tray. That's when he looked down. The burlap sack. Still there, still folded. Calvin stared at it, then at the gunner, who had already begun shouting, "We're going to lose the gun." "Come on," he didn't explain, didn't ask. He just ripped open the sack, pulled out the homemade belt and started loading it into the feed tray. The gunner's eyes widened. "You serious?" But Calvin didn't speak. His hands moved on instinct. The belt slid in smooth. No resistance. The waxed cloth held shape even in the freezing air. The rounds fit snugly in each loop, aligned like teeth in a perfect jaw. The gunner gripped the trigger. The Sherman shook. This time the gun didn't cough or stall, it roared. The coaxial machine gun opened up in a long, uninterrupted burst, cutting through trees, snow and bodies alike. German soldiers dove for cover. Calvin saw 2 of them drop mid-sprint, their rifles spinning from their hands. For the first time all morning, no one inside the tank said a word. The gun just kept firing, and firing, and firing. Minutes passed. Dozens of rounds spent. The belt fed through the receiver like silk ribbon. Outside, the Germans hesitated. One of their half-tracks tried circling right, only to be met by the Sherman's cannon. Calvin reloaded, and they destroyed it in a single shot. Then the tank on their left flank caught fire. Direct hit. Still they didn't move. Still the gun kept going. No one could believe it. The homemade belt, marked, dismissed, forgotten, was working better than anything they had ever used. "Jesus," the gunner muttered. "This thing feeds like a dream." Calvin didn't smile. He was already pulling the second belt from the sack. They weren't out of the woods. Far from it. But for the first time since the attack began, they weren't just surviving. They were fighting back. The men inside Lion Charlie 4 would later describe that hour as the longest, loudest, and most terrifying stretch of their lives. Shells landed so close they felt the heat inside the turret. Smoke crept through the vents. The walls trembled. Twice they thought the engine had died, but it held. And all the while the machine gun never stopped. 1 belt, 4 hours, no jams. The risk and the turnaround. Keep feeding it. For the first few minutes no one acknowledged it. The homemade ammo belt kept feeding. The gun kept firing. And the men inside the Sherman just operated like a single machine, each man doing his part, not questioning how or why it worked, just grateful that it did. But as the second hour ticked in, something changed. The gunner, Staff Sergeant Lewis Hall, leaned back between bursts, panting, his gloves dark with sweat. He looked at Calvin almost sheepishly. "You got another one of those things?" Calvin nodded. "Two more. Back pocket of the sack." Hall didn't hesitate. "Load it up. We're not stopping." Up in the commander's hatch, Lieutenant Jarvis barked into a dead radio, then down at Calvin. "That's your invention?" Calvin paused. "Yes, sir," Jarvis grunted. "Looks like you just saved our lives, Private." No sarcasm, no eye roll, just 5 words. And they hit Calvin harder than any explosion he'd heard that morning. Outside, the snow was red in patches. Steam hissed from the cracked hull of a nearby tank. The forest echoed with distant machine gun chatter and the occasional boom of distant artillery. But here in this battered patch of ground, Lion Charlie 4 was still alive, because of a cloth belt no one believed in. By the 3rd hour, the other tanks had noticed. A Sherman to their right called over through signal flags, asking how they were still suppressing. Jarvis leaned out, held up the belt like a prize catch. The tank commander across the clearing just stared. 10 minutes later, a runner, a corporal with a bandaged leg, rushed through open ground, ducking fire, clutching a note. "Can you spare one belt?" Jarvis looked at Calvin. Calvin didn't hesitate. "Give them the second." "I'll reload the third now." By now the snow had melted in a wide radius around the Sherman's engine. Steam poured from the hatch. Shell casings filled the floor like brass puddles. Calvin's uniform was soaked through. His fingers were numb and blistered. But the belt fed smooth. Over and over. What began as a desperate gamble had become a quiet revolution. At some point the joke stopped. No one called it Calvin's quilt anymore. No one laughed about sewing machines or farm boys with too much time on their hands. Instead, they asked how he made it, what material he used. Could he teach them? In that frozen patch of Belgium, during one of the bloodiest surprise offensives of the war, a 22-year-old loader from Kentucky rewrote the rules of battlefield logistics. Not with rank, not with orders, but with needle, thread, and sheer determination. And by the 4th hour, every man in that tank knew one thing. They weren't just fighting with a machine. They were fighting with an idea stitched together under candlelight. And for once the army wasn't laughing. The 4-hour miracle. The fire doesn't stop. By the 3rd hour of fighting, Lion Charlie 4 was the only Sherman still holding position on the ridge. Smoke curled from the engine vents. The barrel of the main cannon glowed faintly red from repeated fire. Brass casings jammed the floor beneath Calvin's boots, rattling with every turn of the turret. Outside, the snow was shredded, no longer white but churned into grey slush by heat, explosions, and blood. But the gun kept firing. The coaxial machine gun had now gone through nearly 500 rounds, fed entirely by the 3 homemade belts Calvin had stitched weeks earlier, in silence, in shadows, under flickering light. Each loop measured by hand, spaced with a hand-carved ruler sealed with wax, held its shape. Each round chambered clean. Not a single jam, not a single stall, just the steady mechanical rhythm of survival. Rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat. The Germans had tried flanking twice. Both times the gun met them head-on, stitching bursts through tree lines, sending riflemen scrambling. One unit attempted to rush with grenades. They were cut down before they crossed the trench line. At one point, a German half-track advanced from the west, its commander standing upright, barking orders. Hall didn't hesitate. The coaxial tracked left. Calvin kept feeding. 20 rounds, then 10 more. The half-track swerved, its windshield shattered, the gunner slumped. The vehicle veered off and exploded against a stump. The entire ridge echoed with cheers from nearby foxholes. Inside the tank, Calvin didn't smile. He was already threading the last 6 feet of belt through the receiver. Lieutenant Jarvis leaned down, wiping fog from his goggles. "You sure that thing's not magic?" Calvin shook his head. "No, sir." "Just stitched, right?" Jarvis chuckled. "Remind me to put that in the after-action report." It wasn't just their tank that was changing. Other crews began adapting on the fly. By the 4th hour, 2 nearby tanks, crippled and running low on ammo, sent their loaders across open ground under cover fire, just to retrieve scraps of Calvin's design. One of them took the second homemade belt Calvin had stored in his pack. Another crew, desperately low, tried to mimic the structure using cotton from uniform sleeves and cut leather from satchels. They worked with sewing needles looted from medic kits, and thread from torn sleeping bags. Because suddenly the army's problem wasn't lack of courage. It was lack of cloth. And Calvin Briggs, once dismissed as the quiet mechanic with a farm boy hobby, was now the unspoken key to an entire defensive line. Then the artillery stopped. No more shells fell. The German fire slackened. Their pushes became lighter, shorter, less coordinated. Smoke drifted through the trees in long, ghostly lines. Bodies littered the snowdrifts. The counterattack had hit a wall, and it was built from steel, sweat, and one stitched-together belt of cloth and hope. When the fighting finally died down after 4 hours of relentless pressure, Lion Charlie 4 was still upright, scorched, dented, but intact. Inside, the men sat in stunned silence, breathing in steam and smoke, blinking through the haze of powder and sweat. The coaxial's barrel was blackened, almost too hot to touch. But the feed tray, still clean, still cycling. Hall set down the last casing, his voice hoarse. That thing, it never quit. Calvin looked at his hands, burned, raw, the fingertips bloodied, where the cloth loops had scraped his skin with each reload. He didn't feel heroic. He felt empty, exhausted, but also, for the first time since stepping onto European soil, understood that what he'd made wasn't just clever, it was needed. In a war powered by mass production, by factory lines and endless crates stamped with serial numbers, Calvin had done the unthinkable. He had built something by hand that outperformed the war machine. And that miracle, that humble hand-stitched belt, had kept death outside their hatch for 4 straight hours. Where did you learn to do this? The silence that followed the battle was louder than the gunfire. The Ardennes forest, moments earlier alive with screams, explosions, and the clatter of machine gun fire, now lay still under a bruised sky. Smoke twisted lazily through the treetops. Trees had been split down the middle. Craters steamed with heat. Blood ran black in the snow. Inside Lion Charlie 4, the crew sat motionless, not because they were unharmed, but because they were alive. Lieutenant Jarvis was the first to break the silence. He climbed halfway out of the hatch, looked over the ridge, then dropped back down into the turret. He turned to Calvin. What was that thing made of again? Calvin cleared his throat, voice dry as sandpaper. Cotton strips, wax, some stitching from a seat harness. Jarvis blinked. And it never jammed? No, sir. Not once. The lieutenant reached for his notebook, opened to a blank page, and began writing. Not a reprimand, not a warning, an entry, a record. 2 hours later, with wounded stabilized and the front temporarily calm, a group of officers visited the tank. Among them were logistics sergeants, 2 lieutenants from other platoons, and a captain from battalion headquarters. They all came to see the belt, the same one Calvin had been mocked for. Now it was laid out carefully on the rear armor plating of the Sherman, stretched like a sacred relic. It was darkened with powder residue, stiff in places from heat, but every loop still held shape. The captain examined it for a full minute before speaking. "Where did you learn to do this?" Calvin looked down at his gloves. "My dad. Farm stuff, fixing gear, sewing feed bags." The captain nodded slowly. "Think you could make a few more?" "I can try. Try fast." By the next morning, Calvin had been pulled from frontline duty temporarily and assigned to a supply tent less than a mile from the ridge. The order came straight from battalion command. His job: reproduce the belt. They gave him cloth, tools, even assistance. 2 other soldiers who knew their way around a needle and thread. They worked on crates under a canvas tarp, hands shaking from the cold, cutting and stitching while artillery thumped in the distance. By the end of the day, they had 9 belts. By the end of the week, 34. Word spread quickly. Crews across the sector began requesting Briggs belts, as they were now unofficially known. Some copied the design outright. Others experimented with variations, adding extra stitching, different loop sizes, oil-based sealants. None were quite as reliable as the original, but they worked. More importantly, they gave crews confidence, because nothing in war is more dangerous than hesitation, and nothing causes hesitation faster than an unreliable weapon. And thanks to a 22-year-old farm kid from Kentucky, there was now one less thing to worry about inside a Sherman. Calvin never gave speeches. He never asked for credit. But every time another loader came by to ask, "How'd you make this feed so smooth?" he'd kneel beside them, lay out the strip of cotton, and explain, patiently, precisely, humbly. He didn't teach invention. He taught pride in doing something right no matter how small. And for the men around him, who'd once laughed, who'd once dismissed him as a hobbyist with too much time on his hands, that quiet skill became something sacred. Because in a war filled with chaos, uncertainty, and machines that broke too often, Calvin Briggs had made something that held, something they could count on. What happened after the war? The war ended 5 months later. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Victory in Europe Day. Streets flooded with celebration from London to New York. Soldiers wept, kissed strangers, raised toasts. But in a quiet field hospital near Liège, Belgium, Calvin Briggs didn't celebrate. He slept for the first time in days. He'd been working round the clock, even after the Battle of the Bulge ended. The Briggs belts had made their way across 3 divisions by March, and though they were never formally adopted into army supply chains, they were copied, modified and praised in hushed tones by the men who owed them their lives. Calvin was offered a recommendation for a Bronze Star. He declined, said the real heroes were the men who never made it home. When he returned to Kentucky later that year, the farm was still standing, but barely. His father had passed during the war. His younger brother, too young to enlist, had done his best to keep the place running. Calvin picked up where he left off. He fixed tractors. He welded gates. He married a schoolteacher named June and had 2 children. He never bragged, never hung medals on the wall. Most of his neighbors didn't even know he'd served, let alone that he'd helped turn the tide of one of the most ferocious battles of the war, with nothing but cloth, grease, and grit. But a few letters trickled in, one from a former tank commander in the 99th Infantry Division, one from a supply officer in Bastogne, one from a crewman who wrote simply, "You don't know me, but your belt worked, and because of that I got to see my daughter turn 1. Calvin never replied to most of them. He didn't need to. He hadn't made the belt for recognition. He'd made it because something didn't work, and he couldn't live with that. Decades passed. He built a garage on the edge of town, taught his son to change brake pads, his daughter to solder wire. He stayed quiet during parades, waved politely at Veterans Day gatherings, listened more than he talked. But once a year, on a cold morning in December, he'd go out to the barn, pull down a dusty box and unroll something faded and frayed, a strip of cotton cloth, darkened with age, stitched by hand. His son once asked him, "Did you really shoot the Germans with that?" Calvin smiled. "No," he said, "but I helped someone who did." That was enough. He died in 1989 in his sleep, after repairing the same tractor he had first worked on with his father before the war. No monument bears his name. No textbook tells his story. But ask any man who served in the Ardennes that winter, and they might remember a tank, a machine gun that didn't stop, and a quiet man who stitched life into a belt when the world was falling apart. War is often remembered in numbers. 16 million Americans served in World War II. Over 400,000 died. Tens of thousands of tanks rolled across Europe. Millions of rounds fired. Billions of dollars spent. But behind every statistic is a person, a face, a name, a small moment that changed everything. Calvin Briggs didn't win the war. He didn't lead charges or capture enemy generals. He never made the front page of a newspaper. But for 4 hours in the middle of a frozen forest, when everything broke, when the manuals failed and the official gear collapsed under the weight of war, his invention worked. Because it was made not by a factory, but by hands that understood machines. Because it was born not from orders, but from observation, failure, and quiet determination. Because he cared enough not to wait for someone else to fix the problem. There's a lesson in that. In a world where most people wait to be told what to do, Calvin Briggs stitched a new answer. Not because he wanted recognition, but because he refused to accept that good enough was good enough when lives were on the line. In the chaos of war, we often look for heroes in grand gestures, but sometimes heroism looks like a young man hunched over a lamp, fingers raw, measuring thread against spent casings, sewing in silence while the world laughs. And when the smoke clears and the silence returns, it's those small acts, the ones no one noticed at the time, that end up making all the difference. That's the paradox of World War II. It was the largest, most industrialized conflict in human history, won not only by generals, strategies, and production numbers, but also by individuals who saw what was broken and dared to fix it, even with cloth, even with thread, even with hands that shook in the cold. We don't remember Calvin Briggs because he demanded it. We remember him because when the machine gun wouldn't fire, and the cold made steel useless and death waited in the trees, he gave the Sherman a voice. And for 4 hours that voice roared through the forest, defiant and unbroken. What shocked you most? Comment below. Share this story with someone who still believes one person can't make a difference. Thank you for watching.